In this presentation, we cover the basics of biology as it pertains to the ocean. So first, we should probably touch on the 7 characteristics that define living organisms, particularly as living organisms in the oceans can be quite diverse in structure. So, I'll give you a second to try and guess some of these. All right. So hopefully you came up with at least a couple of these. First is that there is an order or a structure to living organisms, and that order and structure is kind of layered. Secondly, there is some form of reproduction that must occur from their own kind. Growth and development is another requirement, as is processing energy, and organisms need to regulate their internal environment, so find some means of being able to regulate it so that they can, exist in whatever habitat they live in. They also need to respond to an external environment. So they have to have some mechanism by which they can sense that external environment in order to kind of adjust their internal regulation and also to kind of physically move or shift themselves in response to any kind of stimuli that might occur. Finally, we have this last concept of evolution and adaptation. And truly, organisms need to be able to evolve or adapt to their environment, but this characteristic is actually at the population level and not the individual level. Individuals do not evolve, but populations or groups of animals do over time. So next, just taking a look at the levels of organization in biology. Biology is quite interesting because of the fact that you can kind of find a discipline that fits within any of these kind of levels or disciplines. So first off, if we start off with the biosphere, which is a certain kind of overall region on Earth. And within that biosphere, let's say Florida, there's an ecosystem, such as the Florida Everglades in this image. From within the ecosystem, biologists can study organisms at the community level. For instance, within the wetland ecosystem. Just below that, biology is kind of broken down into the population level. So some biologists study the population of a particular species that are found within that particular ecosystem and that particular biosphere. Next, biologists can study or can research things at the organismal level. So for instance, we have an American alligator here. Just beyond that, after the organismal level, there's some disciplines of biology that study just simply organ systems, so the nervous system or the cardiovascular system. Breaking it down further, you can just take a look at and study and discuss biology in terms of a particular organ, such as the brain, or the tissues that make up that organ, such as the nervous tissue for the brain, or on the cellular level. A lot of studies that we're kind of familiar with hearing about in the news are really looking at things on a cellular level, particularly when it comes to, how certain drugs and whatnot are effective against things like COVID. Beyond that, you can look at the organelles that exist within a cell, and finally at the very bottom, shouldn't say lowest level on the totem pole, but on the smallest or kind of as far detail as you can get is on the molecular level, so looking at things like DNA. There are several building blocks of living organisms. Organisms are comprised of generally a combination of these building blocks, and we tend to discuss those in terms of what we call monomers, which are small structures of these particular building blocks, or large polymers, which are the larger kind of chains of monomers, so the larger structures of these building blocks. And really these building blocks are referring to macromolecules. There are 4 different types of macromolecules that make up living organisms, including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So within the macromolecule of carbohydrates, the smaller structures are referred to as monosaccharides, for example. So for instance, something like glucose is an example of a monomer for the carbohydrate macromolecule group. Glucose is a really small, simple sugar, and when you chain a bunch of these glucose structures together, you get something called a polysaccharide. Mono refers to the word, or translates to the word one, poly translates to the word many, and saccharide translates to the word sugar. So when we take a bunch of, when you're discussing the monomers of these carbohydrates, it does make a unique and distinct structure called, for example, starch. However, starch is really just a series or chain of simple glucoses. Lipids, the second macromolecule kind of group that make up organisms, include monomers, which are fatty acids, and phospholipids, which are the polymers. For example, phospholipids are responsible for making up the cell membrane. You have a phospholipid bilayer that makes up that cell membrane. With proteins, the monomers are, or amino acids, are referred to as the monomers, or the small components, and we refer to a polypeptide or a protein as the polymers. Proteins are pretty wild because of the fact that they can really contribute a lot to the structure and to the functioning of an organism. And each of these should mention do have certain purposes. So for instance, carbohydrates are responsible for short-term and long-term energy, depending on the structure, if they're a monomer or polymer. Lipids are really responsible for providing structure to organisms as well as providing long-term energy storage. Proteins are responsible for control or regulation of certain internal processes as well as for providing structure. And then our last macromolecule group here is nucleic acids, for which the nucleotide is the monomer, and the polymers are something you're probably familiar with: DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, which is just simply ribose nucleic acid. So nucleic acids are responsible for really just kind of storing information and taking that information and translating it into certain proteins and such. There's several persistent themes in biology. First off is the law of conservation of mass. So this essentially means that mass is never really destroyed, it just kind of changes form. Best example, easiest example I can think of is if we think of a campfire. You've got a log that you kept fire to, and eventually it changes form and it changes into ash, and then much of it turns into heat that's released. So there's a conservation of that mass that occurs, but it just changes form. There's also the law of conservation of energy. So same kind of thing. Energy just changes form and can be changed from something such as solar energy into chemical energy or heat or things along those lines. And finally, we have this negative and positive kind of attraction that's occurring on the kind of chemical level. And this particularly is taking us back to Chemistry 101, where we're talking about the attraction between protons and electrons. So this push and pull really of that's being guided or kind of forced by these two different charges are what's helpful for structures within organisms to be able to function the way they do. For instance, DNA has a slightly negative charge to it, and because of that slightly negative charge due to the phosphate in the structure of DNA, there ends up being a propensity for things like DNA to dissolve in aqueous solutions, things like that. So a lot of the reasons why things work on a cellular level have to do with this positive and negative attraction. We can classify life or living organisms into one of 3 domains, and within those domains we can have 1 to 4 different kingdoms. So in the domain bacteria, we just have a group called bacteria, so just a single kind of group in that. You all are probably familiar with some form of bacteria. We also have the domain archaea, which largely consists of extinct forms of small single cellular organisms, But there are also some organisms, some kind of funky ones that are like exist at the base of some ones that are going to exist in some extreme environments that are part of that group Archaea. But there's only a few that are extant. Most are extinct. Within the domain Eukarya, this is kind of where we find most of the organisms that we're responsible, or that we're familiar with. So the kingdom Animalia, obviously, you all are familiar with animals. Kingdom Plantae consists of plants. Kingdom Fungi is going to be things like yeast and mushrooms and other funguses. And then Protista, or Kingdom Protista, is going to consist of these organisms. They're kind of a weird cellular mix. They can be kind of photosynthetic, similar to plants, but also can have characteristics of organisms that kind of ingest energy. So they're kind of a funky group. Now, there's a certain flow of energy and matter that occurs within ocean environments. And I should kind of reiterate, consistent with this conservation of energy, that there's this movement of energy through an ecosystem. So you get light from the sun that's going to be responsible for producing chemical energy via producers, such as plants. That chemical energy will then be kind of transferred to consumers, such as this little moose here who's chowing down on some plants. So organisms such as animals will eat or ingest those plants and break down some of that energy that's been built into glucose and other kind of structures. That consumer will not only use that energy for certain internal processes, but also release some of that as heat. So it's important to note that there is a flow of energy, both energy and matter, that occurs in ecosystems. However, the difference is energy moves through an ecosystem, but matter is going to cycle within an ecosystem. So the material elements within an ecosystem are going to be continually reused. Eventually, over time, they'll be broken down into smaller bits used over and over within the ecosystem. Whereas energy is going to be kind of injected into the ecosystem through the form of light, sunlight, and ultimately, as it processes through this ecosystem, it's going to leave via the mechanism of heat. Energy harvesting then is really important. There's a couple different processes by which energy can be harvested. Photosynthesis only occurs in autotrophs, which translates to the word self-feeders. And essentially, in this process, autotrophs are able to make glucose, or organic matter, and create oxygen. That should be a kind of a subscript too, but it's a little challenging to see that in this particular format. Creates oxygen gas from sunlight energy and carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration is a complementary process that is conducted by both autotrophs and heterotrophs, and essentially includes that glucose that's created within the autotrophs being turned into other components with the help of things like nutrients as well as oxygen. So most important nutrients in the ocean, again, are going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and silica, and those are going to be used in this, useful in not only the creation of different structures, but also helpful as nutrients within this process of cellular respiration. In this figure to the right-hand side, you kind of see the more like a workflow diagram for how this whole process works, with sunlight energy being injected into the chloroplasts and then transferred or transformed into this product of glucose and oxygen. That then is going to be used by the mitochondria, or within the mitochondria, it's going to be used by a process of cellular respiration. And that cellular respiration is really important because it's taking a molecule of energy, this glucose, running it through and transforming it into something called ATP, which is a structure, a molecule that can be used to perform cellular work. So it can be used to create molecules, it can be responsible for moving a muscle. There's a million things that ATP, which is the cellular currency, is used for. After that ATP is generated, you get byproducts of water and carbon dioxide, which are then kind of injected into that photosynthesis process. They're inputs into that. So we see that there's a consistent recycling of materials that occurs. Finally, this chemical energy is used up, and as part of the release of that, only a small percentage gets used for work. A large percentage of it actually gets released as heat. So it's also important to note, just FYI, that a lot of us think of plants as photosynthesizing, but they also do need to conduct this cellular respiration. It's a requirement of eukaryotic cells. So nutrient cycling, then, is going to be where there's a changing of abiotic elements into biotic elements. So it's taking raw materials and turning it into something useful for the organism, and then eventually turning it back into those raw materials again. Primary production is the process by which those autotrophs are producing more organic material than they use in this process of respiration. So even though they do have mitochondria and they do have a requirement and a need to make ATP, they're still generating a ton of glucose that they don't necessarily need. Decomposition is where there's another form of nutrient cycling where there's a breakdown in the organic matter of an organism into organic and inorganic particles. Organic just refers to something that can be used as in some form readily and in its current structure by a living organism for some purpose. So just again, in thinking about this cycling of matter, you find that living organisms, so our plants, animals, bacteria, and fungi, are going to need to consistently use things like nitrogen and water and carbon. And then through that process, there's going to be a breakdown of material into things like water, soil, air, and energy, which are considered abiotic or non-living elements. Those then are going to contribute, again, carbon, water, nitrogen back into those biotic organisms. So there's kind of a sharing and back and forth of these different biotic or living components and abiotic or non-living elements in an ecosystem. This is just an example of one form of a nutrient cycle for nitrogen. In this figure, you can see that there's a certain form of nitrogen that's produced in the oceans or kind of injected into the oceans through weathering of rocks and whatnot. That nitrogen is really important for organisms, but it is only important if it is in a certain format. So there is something called nitrogen fixing that needs to occur in order to make that nitrogen usable. And really it's just usually the addition of a different element onto a molecule that contains nitrogen, or transforming that molecule into another kind of form of a nitrogen-based molecule. So that nitrogen then kind of gets incorporated into organisms. It's used as a building block of DNA. Those organisms get consumed, so that gets pumped into other larger prey and predators, and ultimately everything dies and breaks down, and all the nitrogen then is broken down as well into this returning to this abiotic format, where it's just kind of some unusable form of nitrogen that then needs to be fixed again for organisms to use. So there's this sometimes an extra layer of things that need to occur in order to make it useful for organisms. Okay, there are several different cell types and categories of cells. And this figure shows us the two different kind of groups of cells. The large one off to the left is a eukaryotic cell, and the super small one up here in the right is a prokaryotic cell. So here you can see some of those big differences are the fact that we have some large, what we call organelles, larger structures in a eukaryotic cell that help to carry out various processes and produce larger proteins and things like that. We also have something called a nucleus in the middle, which is a membrane-enclosed structure that contains the DNA. In the prokaryotic cells, we do also have DNA, but there is no nucleus. It's not membrane bound. It's just kind of located within one part of the cell. Prokaryotic cells also have a cellular membrane, as do eukaryotic cells, but eukaryotic cells are going to have a bit more complex of a cellular membrane, or a different structure, I should say. Shouldn't say more complex, but tends to be a little bit different than prokaryotic organisms. Typically speaking, prokaryotic cells have a single strand of DNA, where eukaryotic cellular organisms have multiple strands of DNA. So for instance, we have 46 chromosomes within humans. It's important to note that eukaryotic cellular organisms can consist of a single cell organism, as are all prokaryotic cells, or they can be multicellular organisms such as plants and animals. A couple examples to kind of help you differentiate between the two cell types. On the top here we have prokaryotic marine organisms such as bacteria and the archaea. Eukaryotic marine organisms can be phytoplankton or marine fungi or microscopic organisms or whales. Like, there's quite a few broad ranges within eukaryotic organisms. Cell transportation is really important. It's important to understand how there's a movement of water and ions across the cell membrane, and how that process is going to be regulated by several different things. First, we have a concept of diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion is the movement of atoms or molecules from an area of high concentration to an area low concentration, and osmosis is basically that same process but across a semi-permeable membrane, so a membrane that has certain pores or holes in it. And if I take a look down here at this figure here, on the left-hand side, we can kind of have a visual of the two. So in diffusion, you might have a little container of water. You might drop a dye or some other molecule into that water, and that dye starts to shift and move and spread within that within that solvent until it reaches a state of equilibrium, which is where there's an even distribution of the molecules from that substance. In osmosis, you're going to literally have some form of a barrier, and oftentimes the solutes, or the structures like salt or whatever kind of physical molecule is making up the solutes that's being put into a solvent like water to dissolve. The solutes tend to be too large to cross that barrier. So if that's the case, because equilibrium still has to be met, there needs to be an equal kind of proportion of the solvent and the solute, the water will actually cross that membrane. So this is what we see happen in when we're talking about lots of organisms and there being a difference in the salt concentration on one side of a barrier versus the other. A barrier can also be a cell membrane. Cellular activities are also regulated by two other forms of transport called facilitated and active transport. So in facilitated transport or diffusion, essentially this is an assisted form of transportation of a substance across a membrane. There's no energy that's required, and it's really useful with polar or charged substances. And essentially there's going to be some form of a transport protein that is kind of injected or embedded within a cellular membrane that is going to be specific to a certain type of solute, so a certain molecule dissolved within a aqueous solution, and that solute will be encouraged to transport along that transport protein, oftentimes by an opposite charge found within the middle of that protein. Active transport is where the cell will actually expend energy in order to move a solute against a concentration gradient, or from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So it's really the cell using its energetic resources in order to force a solute to move because it needs it for some purpose. there's several osmotic processes that are helpful in understanding how osmosis works on a organismal level. First, we have something called osmoconformers, which is where they have no mechanism of controlling osmosis, and are otherwise termed isoosmotic. This means that they can't have a different internal kind of solute concentration of the aqueous solutions inside of them, as opposed to their external marine environment. So whatever the salt concentration is on the exterior of their body is going to be the salt concentration on the interior of their body as well. So they kind of have an equilibrium between the outside and inside of their body. We also have something called osmoregulation, which is where some more complex organisms are going to control the water balance between the cell and their surroundings. This is very important because of the fact that if they don't have this regulation in place, you can end up with situations such as the in a hypotonic solution, where there's going to be a higher concentration of a solute inside the cell versus outside, so water will move inside. You also can have an isotonic, well, actually this is ideal, right? Isotonic solution where you have an equal concentration of the solute levels inside and outside of the cell, and thus the cell remains normal. And then you can have a situation where a cell is hypertonic, which is basically, in this form of tonicity, is where there's going to be a high solute level on the outside or exterior of a cell versus the inside. So within animal cells, these two conditions, the hypotonic as well as the hypertonic kind of scenarios, that can result in some true damage to the cell. Plant cells actually can kind of deal with this whole hypotonic solution by storing water within a vacuole and kind of by having this cell wall that allows them to remain turgid or kind of bulging. But in that hypertonic solution situation, their cell membrane is going to tear away from that cell wall and the cell will be permanently damaged. So the reason why there has to be some cellular regulation is because of these conditions of tonicity, specifically the hypotonic scenario and the hypertonic scenario. So if they don't have some form of regulation, cells would obviously not survive that for animals. A good example is this saltwater fish. Here the blue arrows represent water movement. So water is moving exterior or outside of the fish because of the fact that there is a higher solute concentration out there, which means that they also have movement of an ion. And ions are going to move interior to the fish across that cell, their skin and whatnot. But it's also going to be expelled through the gills and also expelled extensively through excretion or via a concentrated urine. So despite the fact that these ions are moving constantly, kind of shifting into the cells of this organism, there's going to be a large excretion, highly concentrated urine there. So yeah, there's some form of regulation that occurs, and essentially the saltwater fish will drink ample water in order to make sure that it can kind of have enough water present in order to deal with this loss of water through the skin. Finally, a note on reproduction. So survival and reproduction in the ocean is an important thing, and there's several strategies for that. We find that there's an R to K scale of reproduction strategies. And this is kind of, this is a terrestrial kind of example, but this is really across all organisms. But essentially, these two different strategies are means by which an organism can kind of try and proliferate and have their species persist. So an R species is going to be a species that has a lot of offspring within a year. This is it's a clam or oyster, there you go. An oyster here will create over, 500 million, that's a lot, 500 million offspring, fertilized eggs within a single year. Fish can create 8,000 in a single year. And then you start moving away from these very R type of organisms or organisms that have a high R strategy, and you shift towards more of a K strategy. And these K strategies are going to be organisms that have reproduction infrequently, so either 2 times a year, as in this mountain lion, or once every 5 years, such as in this gorilla. But there's a lot of care that goes into that, into kind of raising that young or that offspring. Just to give you an idea of some characteristics of the survivorship as well as the growth of these different types of, reproductive strategy types of species. On the left-hand side, we have a growth curve, and time is on the x-axis, population size is on the y-axis. The red line is representing the R-selected species. So there's huge explosions and reductions in that population over time, and it really is pervasive throughout time. There's just going to be periods of time where there's a lot of them and periods where there's less of them. This carrying capacity here, not to confuse it, but there's also a K there. Carrying capacity here is what is going to be the cap on resources for that particular species. So if their populations do crawl above that, oftentimes they're not going to have enough for all of those organisms to survive, and that's kind of partially why you see this little crash. K-selected species will grow in terms of their population size up to that carrying capacity, where there's a limit to the amount of food, the amount of water, the amount of space for those organisms, and it'll kind of usually hover around that line unless there's a dramatic drop in the species for some reason. So carrying capacity within a region or the amount of resources available is going to restrict these K-selected species, but isn't really as kind of stringent at restricting the R-selected species. In the figure to the right, we have a percentage of maximum lifespan on the x-axis in this survivorship curve, and a number of survivors on the y-axis. There's also another kind of element to this is something like the R-selected species, such as fish here, have a high number of survivors early on in life, but obviously those little, 8,000 fish are going to get eaten off very quickly, so that you have a dramatic reduction initially in the lifespan of, in the number of survivors that get to an older age in fish. Humans, which are an example of a K-selected species, have a high survivorship in their offspring that are going to continue on for a longer lifespan. And then finally, kind of the middle of the road species here is represented by the rabbit, which is a type 2 kind of survivorship curve, which is where there's kind of a moderate amount of kind of a relative higher amount of offspring than type 1, but fewer than a K-selected species, but fewer than an R-selected species. And in this survivorship curve, there's going to be a kind of diagonal shift, right? You're not going to have every organism survive, but there is a good amount, about half of it, that does, over the course of the lifespan of the organism. So just some characteristics of the R strategy versus the K strategy species for reproduction. They're going to have a lot of offspring with the R strategy kind of types of species. There's little to no parental care, a high mortality rate in the offspring. Usually they're going to have a smaller body size, and reproduction is typically going to occur once with a lot of these organisms. So they'll just kind of spit out a bunch. What else? The population size, too, can be variable. In the K strategy, reproductive strategy organisms, they're going to have fewer offspring, a lot of parental care, low mortality in the organisms, a larger body size, and they can reproduce multiple times, and so on and so forth. Asexual reproduction is a form of reproduction wherein organisms will create a genetically identical offspring. So within the ocean, individuals can reproduce without a partner. They can use a form of asexual reproduction called fission, budding, spores, and regeneration. And then they're energy efficient, and this process doesn't really require a lot of special conditions, so there is a benefit to it. So a couple examples are going to be in this image of the sea anemone here, you have a budding process happening, wherein one organism kind of started growing another one, and then they just kind of separate there. In the example to the right of the sea star, you have regeneration, which is where one of the arms of the sea star actually has some of the cells that are actually kind of similar to stem cells, so they can turn into any kind of cell, such as skin or some other type of tissue within the organism. If one of those arms cuts off, that arm will grow again, it will kind of expand again, but then this arm can actually turn into a whole other sea star. So a lot of prokaryotes, many invertebrates, and hermaphrodites are examples of this in the ocean. Sexual reproduction, as you can imagine, is where you have genetically unique offspring. In this form of reproduction, there's a union of two gametes, sperm and egg, and that also means that the parents are going to be genetically different as well. And this is going to be helpful for increasing the diversity of the species. There's also increased risks and energy costs associated with this form of reproduction. So in this particular reproductive strategy, sexual reproduction is found in fish, marine mammals, a whole host of organisms. So that gives you a bit of the fundamental and basic elements of biology that you need to understand about organisms in the marine environment and how they exist within an ecosystem.